The shrill sound of tires screeching against asphalt, followed by a loud crunch, jolted the street to a standstill. Emma Harper threw her car into park and flung open the door, her heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and anger. She stormed to the back of her gleaming white Mercedes, her heels clicking on the pavement. The rear bumper had a noticeable dent, the pristine paint scraped. Her eyes darted to the source of the collision, a battered black pickup truck idling a few feet behind her. The driver stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and black, dressed in a plain blue shirt and jeans. His expression was a mixture of concern and calm, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Are you okay?" he asked, stepping closer. Emma didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pointed at the damage on her car. "Look at what you've done!" "I'm sorry," he said, hands raised defensively. "You stopped abruptly. I didn't have time to brake." Emma glared at him, her anger bubbling over. "So you're saying this is my fault?" "Yes." "No," he said evenly. "I'm just explaining what happened. Let's exchange insurance details and we'll sort this out." She let out a humorless laugh. "Do you even have insurance?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. "What's your name?" she demanded, stepping closer. James Carter," he replied, meeting her gaze. "Well, James, this is coming out of your pocket. I'll make sure of it." "I already said I'll take care of it even though the accident was your fault," James replied. "What? How dare you talk to me like that, you criminal?" Emma shouted. The tension hung thick in the air, and Emma, unable to contain her frustration and anger, slapped him. The sound echoed, drawing the attention of passers-by. James took a step back, his eyes flashing with disbelief and anger. A small crowd had begun to gather, their murmurs growing louder. "You didn't just do that," he said, his voice low and measured. Emma folded her arms, her confidence unshaken. "Oh, I did. And I'll do it again if you don't take responsibility for this." The man stared at her for a long moment before shaking his head. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, turning back to his truck. Emma watched him drive away, her anger still simmering. As she threatened to call the police on him, she didn't realize her actions had set into motion events that would unravel her world. That evening, Emma's husband, David, was hunched over his laptop at the dining table. His job as a contractor was grueling, but the potential payoff was worth it. He was in the running for a massive deal with Carter Enterprises, a company that could change their lives forever. Emma walked into the room, her mood still sour from the day's events. "You won't believe what happened to me today," she said, pouring herself a glass of wine. David barely looked up. "What now?" "Some idiot rear-ended me, completely ruined my bumper," she said, taking a sip. David frowned, finally glancing at her. "Are you okay?" "Oh, I'm fine," she said dismissively. "But the nerve of that guy, acting like it wasn't his fault. Can you believe it?" David sighed. "Did you get his insurance information?" Emma hesitated. "Not exactly." David raised an eyebrow. "Not exactly?" "I may have slapped him," she admitted, setting her glass down. David's eyes widened. "You what? Emma, are you serious? You slapped him? Why would you do that?" She shrugged. "He was being difficult. Besides, he was driving some old junker. It's not like he's going to sue me." David rubbed his temples. "You can't just go around slapping people, Emma. What if he's someone important?" Emma rolled her eyes. "Important? Please? He was driving a truck that looked like it belonged in a junkyard." David didn't press further, though unease settled in the pit of his stomach. He knew his wife had a temper, but this felt different. The next morning, David received an email that made his heart race. It was an invitation to a private luncheon hosted by James Carter, the elusive billionaire CEO of Carter Enterprises. "Emma!" he called out, rushing into the living room. She looked up from her phone. "What's all the excitement?" "I got an invite to meet James Carter himself," David said, holding up his phone. "This could be it, the deal we've been waiting for." Emma smiled. "That's amazing, David. I told you this would work out." David nodded, but a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. The name James tugged at his memory. "What was the name of the guy you said hit your car yesterday?" Emma blinked. "I don't know. James, I think. Why?" David's stomach sank. "James? What did he look like?" She frowned, confused by his sudden intensity. "Tall, black, kind of muscular. Why does it matter?" David sat down heavily, his face pale. "Emma, you didn't slap James Carter, did you?" Her smirk faded. "What? No, that's ridiculous." "Emma," David said, his voice shaking, If you slapped the James Carter, the CEO of Carter Enterprises, we're done. My career is over. Emma's breath caught as realization dawned. No, it couldn't be him. He was driving a beat-up truck. David buried his face in his hands. James Carter is known for being unassuming. He doesn't flaunt his wealth. Emma's pulse quickened. What are we going to do? David didn't answer. He could only hope the man would overlook the incident, or that it wasn't the same James. At the luncheon, David's worst fears were confirmed. As they entered the grand hall, David's eyes locked onto the man standing at the center of the room. Dressed in a tailored suit, he exuded quiet confidence. It was James. Emma recognized him too, her face draining of color. James glanced their way, his expression unreadable. He strode over, the crowd parting as he moved. "Mr. Hall," he said, extending a hand. David shook it nervously. "Mr. Carter, it's an honor to meet you." James's gaze shifted to Emma, who was frozen in place. "And you must be Mrs. Hall. We've met, haven't we?" Emma stammered. Yes, briefly." James's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed, a very memorable meeting." David swallowed hard. "Mr. Carter, James held up a hand. "Save it. We'll see if your work speaks for itself, Mr. Hall. But I value respect and integrity above all else. Keep that in mind." He turned and walked away, leaving them standing in stunned silence.
The ride home from the luncheon was suffocating. David gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his jaw clenched in frustration. Beside him, Emma stared blankly out the window, her mind replaying James Carter's words. "How could you be so reckless?" David finally snapped, breaking the silence. Emma turned to him, her voice defensive. "I didn't know who he was, David. How was I supposed to?"
"That's the problem, Emma. You didn't think," David shot back. "You just assumed he was some nobody because of the car he drove. Now, you've humiliated the man who holds our future in his hands." Emma folded her arms. "He deserved it. He hit my car." David let out a bitter laugh. "Do you hear yourself? Do you even realize the position you've put me in? My entire career could be over because of your temper." The tension in the car was unbearable. Neither spoke another word until they pulled into their driveway. Across town, James Carter sat in his office, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his skyscraper. His assistant, Clara, entered with a folder. "Mr. Carter," she said, setting it on his desk. "Here are the details on David Hall's company." James turned, his expression calm but calculating. He opened the folder, flipping through the pages. "David Hall," he mused aloud. "Good work ethic, innovative ideas. But his wife." Clara hesitated. "Will you still consider his proposal?" James smiled faintly. "Oh, I'll consider it, but not without teaching them a lesson first." A week later, David received an email from Carter Enterprises. They were invited to present their proposal at James's private estate. For David, it was a glimmer of hope. For Emma, it was a looming cloud of dread. "I'll handle the presentation," David said, pacing their living room. "You just stay quiet. Don't say a word unless absolutely necessary." Emma nodded, uncharacteristically subdued. When they arrived at the estate, the grandeur was overwhelming. The sprawling mansion sat atop a hill, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. James greeted them personally, his demeanor as cordial as ever. "Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Hall. I hope you're ready to impress me." David swallowed hard. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Carter." As they entered the lavish dining room, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. James's staff, impeccably dressed, moved about silently, their expressions unreadable. David gave his presentation with fervor, detailing his plans and projections with precision. Emma sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When he finished, James leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "You have an impressive vision, Mr. Hall," James said. "But I'm curious, what drives you? Is it passion, money, or something else?" David hesitated. "I'd say it's passion, sir. I believe in what we're building, and I want to make a difference." James nodded. "Commendable. And you, Mrs. Hall? What drives you?" Emma blinked, caught off guard. I suppose it's the desire to support my husband and our family." James's smile was almost predatory. "Interesting?" After the presentation, James invited them to stay for dinner. The meal was exquisite, but the atmosphere was tense. James seemed to relish asking pointed questions, each one chipping away at Emma's confidence. "So, Mrs. Hall," he said casually, swirling his wine, "what would you say is your greatest flaw?" Emma froze. "Excuse me?" "Everyone has one," James said, his tone disarming. "For me, it's my tendency to trust the wrong people. And you?" David interjected, his voice strained. "Emma's flaw is probably that she's passionate, sometimes a little too passionate." Emma shot him a glare but remained silent. James smiled. "Passion can be a double-edged sword, don't you think?" After dinner, James pulled David aside. "Your proposal has potential, but I have concerns." David's heart sank. "Concerns? What kind of concerns?" James's expression hardened. "Your ability to manage pressure, your judgment, your associations." David's stomach churned. "Mr. Carter, I can assure you—" James held up a hand. "Actions speak louder than words, Mr. Hall. Let's see how you handle the challenges ahead." When David returned to Emma, his face was pale. "What did he say?" she asked nervously. "He's testing us," David muttered. "We need to tread carefully." The following day, an email from Carter Enterprises arrived in David's inbox. The subject line read, "Urgent New Requirements." David's pulse quickened as he opened it. The email outlined a new set of demands for their proposal: additional data, revised projections, and an unrealistic deadline. 72 hours. David groaned, running a hand through his hair. "This is impossible." Emma, standing behind him, read over his shoulder. "It's a trap," she said flatly. "He's setting us up to fail." David shook his head. "We don't have a choice. If we don't deliver, we're out." The next 3 days were a blur of late nights and mounting frustration. David worked tirelessly, but the pressure was taking its toll. Emma couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at her. Her impulsive actions had put David in this impossible position. One evening, while David was buried in work, Emma decided to confront James. She called his assistant, Clara, and arranged a meeting at his office. When Emma arrived, James was seated behind his imposing desk, a faint smirk on his face. "To what do I owe this visit, Mrs. Hall?" he asked, his tone laced with mockery. Emma swallowed hard. "I came to apologize. What I did was wrong, and I deeply regret it." James leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Do you regret it because it was wrong, or because of the consequences?" Emma's cheeks burned. "Both," she admitted, "but mostly because I acted without thinking." James's expression softened slightly. "It takes courage to admit that, but apologies alone won't fix this." James made Emma an offer. He would ease the pressure on David's proposal, but only if she agreed to a public act of humility. "I want you to host a charity event," James said, "to benefit underprivileged communities. You'll personally oversee everything and publicly acknowledge your mistake." Emma bristled at the idea but knew she had no choice. "Fine," she said. "I'll do it." The event was a grand success, attended by influential figures and media outlets. Emma delivered a heartfelt speech, admitting her mistake and pledging to do better. James watched from the sidelines, impressed by her transformation. "Perhaps there's hope for you yet, Mrs. Hall," he said quietly to himself. The charity event marked a turning point for Emma. She began volunteering at local shelters, gaining a new appreciation for people from all walks of life. David noticed the change in her. "You're different," he said one evening. Emma smiled faintly. "I've been given a second chance. I don't want to waste it." With Emma's transformation evident, James decided to give David one last challenge. He invited the Halls to a private meeting at his estate. During the meeting, James presented them with a revised contract, one that offered a lucrative deal but came with a catch. They would have to commit a portion of their profits to community development. David hesitated, knowing it would strain their finances, but Emma surprised him by saying, "We'll do it." James smiled. "You've both come a long way. Consider this contract a reward for your growth and a reminder of the importance of humility and compassion." As they signed the contract, David felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Emma, too, felt a sense of relief and pride. In the end, the Halls realized that success wasn't just about wealth or power. It was about character, integrity, and the impact they made on others. James, too, found solace in knowing he had helped them grow, even if his methods had been unconventional. Their paths crossed again years later, not as adversaries but as allies, united by their shared commitment to making the world a better place.